The ship appeared without warning on a Tuesday morning in March of 2157, and it was larger than anything humanity had ever built or imagined. It hung above New York City like a metal mountain, blocking out the sun and casting a shadow that stretched for miles in every direction. People stopped in the streets and looked up with their mouths open, unable to speak or move or think. Cars crashed into each other because drivers forgot to watch the road. Planes were forced to change their paths, and military jets scrambled from bases across the eastern coast of the United States. But no weapon on Earth could scratch that ship. And everyone who looked at it knew this truth in their bones: the ship did not attack, and it did not communicate. And for 3 days, it simply waited while the world below descended into chaos. Governments held emergency meetings that lasted through the night, and scientists pointed their instruments at the vessel and found readings that made no sense according to any known physics. Religious leaders called it a sign from heaven, or hell, depending on their beliefs. And ordinary people packed their belongings and fled the cities or stayed in their homes and prayed on the 4th day. The aliens finally spoke. A being made of living crystal materialized in the main chamber of the United Nations. Appearing from thin air in the middle of an emergency session, it stood 12 feet tall, and its body shifted through colors that human eyes could barely process. And when it spoke, its voice came not from a mouth but from everywhere at once. The being called itself Valith, and it claimed to speak for something called the Conclave of 12. The Conclave, Valith explained, was an alliance of the 12 oldest and most powerful civilizations in the galaxy, and they had watched over the younger species for millions of years. They maintained order and prevented wars and guided the development of promising worlds toward peaceful coexistence, and they had been watching Earth for a very long time. Valith's words were translated instantly into every language on the planet, broadcast on every screen and radio and device capable of receiving a signal. Your species has been observed, the crystal being announced, and its voice carried no emotion that humans could recognize. Your history has been recorded, and your potential has been calculated, and your future has been determined to pose an unacceptable risk to galactic stability. The chamber fell silent, and presidents and prime ministers and kings looked at each other with fear in their eyes. Valith continued without pause. You are too aggressive and too unpredictable, and too creative in your methods of destruction. And if you are allowed to spread beyond your world, you will bring chaos to civilizations that have known peace for longer than your species has existed. The being raised one crystalline arm, and images appeared in the air showing human history, wars and bombs and concentration camps and mushroom clouds rising over burning cities. The Conclave offers you 2 paths. Valith declared, the first path is submission, and you will accept permanent limitations on your technology and permanent oversight from Conclave observers. And you will never leave your solar system. And you will be contained until your violent nature evolves into something safer. Murmurs of anger rippled through the chamber, but Valith silenced them with a gesture. The second path is annihilation, and your world will be sterilized, and your species will be erased from existence. And the galaxy will continue in peace without the threat you represent. The being paused and looked around the room with eyes that glowed like distant stars. You have 1 standard year to make your choice, and there is no third option, and resistance is not possible because your weapons are toys and your ships are rafts on an ocean you cannot comprehend. Then Valith vanished, leaving behind only the fading echo of its words in a world that would never be the same. Year that followed was the most turbulent in human history. Nations that had been enemies for centuries suddenly found common cause, while alliances that had lasted for decades crumbled overnight. Some governments wanted to surrender immediately, arguing that survival under alien rule was better than extinction. Others called for war, demanding that humanity fight to the last person rather than accept slavery or death. Protests filled the streets of every major city, and the economy collapsed and crime rates soared as people lost hope in any future at all. But in the midst of this chaos, a woman named Amara Okonkwo was working on something that no one else had considered. Dr. Okonkwo was a Nigerian physicist who had spent her career studying the strange mathematics of higher dimensions. And she led a team at the Global Science Collective that had been exploring theoretical ways to fold and bend space itself. Most of her colleagues had dismissed her work as interesting but useless, the kind of pure mathematics that would never have any practical application. But when the aliens arrived, Amara saw something that no one else could see. She saw a door. For months she worked without sleep, filling blackboards with equations and running simulations that pushed computers to their breaking point. Her team grew from a dozen scientists to hundreds, then thousands, as word of her project spread through the underground networks of researchers who refused to accept the conclave's ultimatum. And finally, on a cold night in December, she stood before the Emergency Council of World Leaders with a proposal that made them think she had lost her mind. The conclave expects us to choose between two futures, Dr. Okonkwo said, her voice steady despite her exhaustion. They expect us to fight, or to surrender, because those are the only responses they understand. She pressed a button, and a holographic display appeared showing Earth surrounded by a web of glowing lines. But there is a third option that they never considered because they believe it is impossible. The lines in the display began to fold inward, wrapping around the planet like a cocoon. We will not fight them, and we will not bow to them, Amara declared. We will leave, and we will take our world with us, and we will go somewhere they can never follow. The room erupted in questions and objections and demands for explanation. But Dr. Okonkwo simply smiled. They gave us a year, she said. We only need 18 months. And with those words, humanity began to build its escape from a galaxy that had already condemned it to death. The plan was called Project Threshold, and it was the most ambitious thing humanity had ever attempted. Dr. Amara Okonkwo stood before the united leaders of Earth and explained what she wanted to do. And even she admitted that it sounded like madness. The idea was simple in theory, but impossible in practice. Or at least it should have been impossible, according to everything the galaxy's older civilizations believed about physics. Humanity would build a machine capable of folding space around the entire planet. And then they would step sideways into a dimension that existed outside the normal universe. They would create a pocket reality of their own, a bubble of space-time where Earth could exist forever, beyond the reach of any fleet or weapon. The conclave had given humanity a year to choose between slavery and death. But Amara needed 18 months to build the machine that would let them choose neither. It was not enough time. And everyone knew it was not enough time. But they also knew they had no other choice. The first challenge was convincing the world to work together. And this turned out to be easier than anyone expected. When faced with extinction, old hatreds suddenly seemed very small. Russia shared its military resources with the United States, and China opened its factories to European engineers. And nations that had been fighting border wars for decades laid down their weapons and sent their soldiers to help with construction. Money became meaningless because there was no future to save for, and people worked for food and shelter and the simple hope that their children might survive. The second challenge was keeping the project secret from the conclave, and this was nearly impossible. Alien observers watched Earth from orbit, and their sensors could detect everything from radio signals to the heat signatures of individual human beings. But humanity had one advantage that the conclave had not expected. The aliens did not believe that humans could actually build anything dangerous. They saw the massive construction projects spreading across 6 continents, and they assumed it was either a futile attempt at planetary defense, or simply the chaos of a dying civilization. They did not bother to investigate closely because they did not think it mattered. This arrogance would prove to be their greatest mistake. The Threshold engine was not a single machine, but a network of 10,000 facilities, connected by cables that ran through tunnels bored deep into the Earth's crust. Each facility contained a generator that could produce more power than all the nuclear plants on the planet combined. And each generator was linked to a focusing array that could bend the fabric of reality itself. The construction required materials that did not exist in nature, so humanity invented new ways to create them. It required energy sources that had only been theoretical, so humanity built the first working fusion reactors in a matter of months. It required calculations so complex that no existing computer could handle them. So humanity designed artificial intelligences specifically for the task. Every problem that arose was solved by throwing the combined genius of 8 billion people at it. Workers died by the thousands in accidents and from exhaustion, and their names were recorded on monuments that would travel with Earth into whatever future awaited. Scientists burned out their minds, pushing past the limits of human knowledge, and their discoveries were immediately shared with everyone who could use them. There was no competition, and no secrecy, and no profit motive. Only the desperate unity of a species facing extinction. Ambassador Valeth returned 6 months into the project, appearing once again in the United Nations chamber with its crystalline body flickering through colors of confusion. "We have observed your construction activities," the alien said, and for the first time its voice carried something that sounded almost like curiosity. "Our scientists cannot determine the purpose of what you are building, and we demand an explanation." Dr. Okonkwo was present at this meeting, and she stepped forward to address the alien directly. "We are building our answer to your ultimatum," she said. "Then you have chosen resistance," Veleth replied, and its tone shifted to something cold and final. "This is foolish, and it will only ensure that your end comes sooner and with more suffering." Amara shook her head and smiled, and there was something in that smile that made the ancient alien hesitate. "We have not chosen resistance," she said. "We have chosen to leave, and you cannot stop us because you do not understand what we are doing." Vela stared at her for a long moment, and then it laughed, a sound like glass breaking in slow motion. "Leave and go where, little human? The galaxy is vast, but we control every corner of it, and there is nowhere you can hide that we will not eventually find you." "Who said anything about hiding in your galaxy?" Amara replied. The alien stopped laughing, and something that might have been fear flickered across its crystalline features. "That is not possible," Veleth said, but its voice had lost its certainty. "Your science says it is not possible," Amara agreed, "but your science has been wrong about us from the beginning." The alien vanished without another word, and within hours, the Conclave fleet began moving closer to Earth. They were no longer content to simply observe. They wanted to understand what humanity was building, and they wanted to stop it before it was too late. But it was already too late. The final months were a race against time, with human workers laboring around the clock while alien ships moved into attack positions overhead. The Conclave sent demands and threats and warnings, but humanity ignored them all. On March 14th, 2159, the last connection was made, and the last calibration was completed, and the Threshold engine hummed to life with a sound that could be felt in the bones of every person. On the planet, Dr. Okonkwo stood in the central control room, surrounded by screens showing the status of 10,000 facilities and the positions of hundreds of alien warships. Her hand rested on a simple switch that would activate the final sequence. "They are charging their weapons," one of her assistants reported, his voice tight with fear. "We have maybe 5 minutes before they fire." Amara looked at the screen showing Earth from orbit. the blue and green marble that had been humanity's only home for 200,000 years. Then she looked at the alien fleet. Those massive ships that represented the power of civilizations millions of years old, and she smiled. "Tell everyone to hold on to something," she said. Then she flipped the switch. The threshold engine activated all at once, and reality itself seemed to shudder as space began to fold around the planet. The alien ships fired their weapons, but the beams of energy curved away from Earth as if pushed by an invisible hand aboard every ship in the Conclave fleet. Sensors screamed warnings that made no sense, and instruments showed readings that violated every known law of physics. And then, in a flash of light brighter than 1,000 suns, Earth vanished. The alien fleet was left floating in empty space, their weapons firing at nothing, their sensors showing only the void where a planet had been moments before Ambassador Valith stood on the bridge of the flagship, staring at the empty coordinates where Earth had existed for 4 billion years. Impossible, it whispered, but the evidence was undeniable. Humanity had done the impossible. And now they were gone to somewhere the Conclave could never follow. The galaxy had never known a silence like this. For 10,000 years after Earth vanished, the Conclave of 12 searched every corner of known space looking for some trace of where humanity had gone. They sent probes into the void, between stars and scanned dimensions that most species did not even know existed. They interrogated their greatest scientists and tortured their most brilliant mathematicians, demanding explanations for what should have been impossible. But they found nothing. Earth was simply gone, as if it had never existed at all. The only evidence that humanity had ever been real was the empty space, where their world had once orbited their yellow sun, and the recordings of their final transmission. Dr. Amara Okonkwo's voice saying goodbye in 100 languages before the light swallowed everything. Ambassador Valith became obsessed with understanding what had happened. The crystalline being spent centuries studying human history and human science and human philosophy, trying to find the key that would unlock the mystery of their escape. But the more Valith learned about humanity, the more confused it became. These creatures had been primitive compared to the Conclave's member species. Their technology had been crude, and their understanding of physics had been incomplete. They should not have been able to do what they did, and yet they had done it. Anyway, the first cracks in the Conclave's authority appeared within a decade of humanity's disappearance. Younger species that had accepted the Alliance's rule for millions of years began to ask uncomfortable questions. If the humans could escape, why had no one else ever tried? If the humans could defy the Conclave's ultimatum, what did that say about the Conclave's power? And most dangerous of all, if the humans could do the impossible, then maybe the Conclave's laws about what was and was not possible were simply wrong. The Verati were the first to rebel. They were an insectoid species from the galaxy's outer rim, and they had been subjugated by the Conclave for longer than humans had existed as a species. Their uprising began small, with protests and strikes and minor acts of sabotage. But when the Conclave sent its fleet to crush them, something unexpected happened. The Verati fought back with weapons that should not have existed, weapons based on principles that the Conclave had declared impossible. They had been studying humanity's final transmission, and they had learned something from the species that had escaped. They had learned that impossible was just a word. The Verati rebellion failed eventually, crushed by the overwhelming force of the Conclave's combined military, but the seed of doubt had been planted, and it could not be uprooted. More rebellions followed in the centuries after, and each one was a little stronger and lasted a little longer than the one before. Species that had never questioned their place in the galactic order began to dream of freedom, and those dreams were always haunted by the ghost of humanity. What had become of the strange species that had simply walked away from the galaxy's greatest powers? Were they still alive somewhere beyond the reach of normal space? Were they watching and waiting and preparing for some great return? Or had they destroyed themselves in the attempt to escape, proving that the Conclave had been right to fear them? The uncertainty was perhaps worse than any definitive answer would have been. The Conclave tried to control the narrative, spreading stories that humanity had perished in their foolish experiment. They claimed that the flash of light had been an explosion, not a departure, and that 8 billion humans had died in an instant because they had been too arrogant to accept their place in the cosmic order. But not everyone believed these stories. A cult arose among the younger species, worshipping humanity as gods who had transcended physical existence. They called themselves the Children of Earth, and they believed that humanity would someday return to liberate the galaxy from Conclave tyranny. The Conclave declared this cult illegal and hunted its members across 1,000 worlds. But for every believer they killed, 2 more seemed to take their place as the millennia passed. The galaxy changed in ways that would have been unrecognizable to the species that had built the Conclave. The Great Alliance fractured and reformed and fractured again, and new empires rose and fell like waves on a cosmic ocean. The original 12 species that had founded the Conclave dwindled and declined, their power fading as younger civilizations grew strong. Wars were fought over resources and territory and ideology, and billions died in conflicts that seemed to serve no purpose. And through it all, the legend of humanity grew. They became mythical figures in the stories that parents told their children. The brave species that had refused to kneel. The clever creatures that had found a door where none should have existed. The defiant souls that had turned their backs on a galaxy that had threatened to destroy them. Some versions of the story portrayed them as heroes, and others portrayed them as warnings about the dangers of pride. But all versions agreed on one thing: humanity had done something that no species before or since had ever accomplished. They had escaped, and somewhere, in some realm beyond the reach of Conclave sensors and Conclave ships and Conclave power, they were still out there. The question that haunted every thinking being in the galaxy was simple but terrifying. Would they ever come back? And if they did, what would they have become? 5,000 years after Earth vanished, a young astronomer on a distant world pointed her telescope at the coordinates where humanity's home had once existed. She was not looking for anything in particular, just surveying a region of space that had been empty for longer than her species had possessed the technology to explore it. But on this night, her instruments detected something strange, a faint fluctuation in the fabric of space-time, so subtle that most sensors would have missed it entirely. It lasted for only a fraction of a second, and then it was gone. The astronomer recorded the anomaly in her log and thought nothing more of it. She did not realize that she had just detected the first ripple of something that would change the galaxy forever. After 5,000 years of silence, something was stirring in the void where Earth had been, and it was getting stronger. In the space between spaces, where the rules of normal physics did not apply, humanity had built something wonderful. They called it the Garden, and it was everything Earth had been and everything Earth had never been able to be when the threshold engine had activated on that desperate day in 2159. It had done more than simply move Earth to a new location. It had created an entirely new pocket of reality, a bubble universe where humanity could shape the fundamental laws of existence itself. The transition had been terrifying and beautiful. For 3 days, Earth had hung suspended in a void of pure potential, and the 8 billion humans who clung to its surface had watched as the familiar stars winked out and new constellations took their place. Dr. Amara Okonkwo had stood on a hillside in Nigeria with tears streaming down her face. watching as an artificial sun ignited in the sky above a sun that humanity had designed to burn forever without the threat of eventual expansion or collapse. They had escaped against all odds and all expectations. They had actually escaped. The first centuries in the garden were dedicated to survival and adjustment. The pocket universe was stable but strange, and humanity had to learn new sciences and new technologies to thrive in their new home food. Production had to be reinvented because the soil behaved differently under the artificial sun. Medicine had to be reimagined because human bodies responded unexpectedly to the subtle differences in physics. Architecture had to be redesigned because buildings that would have stood for millennia in the old universe collapsed without warning in the new one. But humanity was nothing if not adaptable, and they solved each problem as it arose with the same desperate creativity that had allowed them to escape in the first place. By the end of the first millennium, the garden had become a paradise beyond anything the old Earth had ever known. The wars that had plagued human history simply stopped. Not because anyone forced them to stop, but because the reasons for war had ceased to exist. There was no scarcity of resources in a universe where resources could be created from pure energy. There was no competition for territory. On a planet where new lands could be grown, like flowers from the fabric of space-time itself, there was no fear of invasion because no invader could reach them. And there was no need for weapons because there was no enemy to fight. Without war, humanity turned its tremendous energy and creativity toward other pursuits. They built cities that floated in the sky, and cities that grew beneath the ocean, and cities that existed in dimensions perpendicular to normal space. They created art forms that would have been impossible in the old universe. Sculptures made of frozen light and music, composed of gravitational waves, and paintings that existed across multiple timelines simultaneously. They developed technologies that the conclave would have declared impossible, and then surpassed those technologies with innovations that made the impossible look primitive. And slowly, generation by generation, they began to change. The first humans to be born in the garden were subtly different from their ancestors, healthier and longer lived and more resistant to disease. Their children were different still, with minds that could process information faster and bodies that could heal from injuries that would have killed their grandparents. By the third millennium, the average human lifespan had extended to several centuries without any artificial intervention. By the fourth millennium, death itself had become optional. This was not immortality in the way that old science fiction had imagined it, not the freezing of people in unchanging states forever. Instead, it was a fundamental shift in what it meant to be human bodies could be regrown or redesigned or transcended entirely. And consciousness could be preserved and transferred and expanded in ways that would have seemed like magic to the humans who had fled Earth. Some chose to remain in bodies that looked much like their ancestors, walking and breathing and eating and sleeping as humans had always done. Others chose to become something new, beings of energy or thought or pure mathematics, exploring aspects of existence that physical bodies could never touch. And some chose to end their existence when they felt ready, passing peacefully into whatever lay beyond the garden's borders. There was no judgment and no pressure either way. Each human was free to define their own path. The old divisions that had separated humanity in the original universe, race and nation and religion and class, faded into meaninglessness over the generations. Children learned about these concepts in history lessons and found them almost impossible to understand. Why would anyone hate another person for the color of their skin or the place of their birth? Why would anyone kill over differences in belief or compete for resources that were available to everyone? The question seemed childish, and in a way they were remnants of a species that had not yet grown up. But even as humanity evolved and transformed and transcended its old limitations, they never forgot where they had come from. The story of the Conclave's ultimatum was taught to every child. The names of those who had died building the threshold engine were carved into monuments that would last forever, and the face of Dr. Amara Okonkwo, the woman who had seen a door where no one else could, watched over the garden from 1,000 statues and 1,000,000 paintings, and the collective memory of a grateful species. She had lived for nearly 2,000 years before finally choosing to rest, and her last words had become a sacred text that every human knew by heart. We did not escape because we were strong, she had said on her final day. We escaped because we were desperate and creative and unwilling to accept that anything was truly impossible. And those are the qualities that will take us further than we can imagine. Amara had been right. By the time 5,000 years had passed in the garden, humanity had become something that even she might not have recognized. They were still human in the ways that mattered, still curious and creative and compassionate and flawed, but they were also something more, something that the galaxy had never seen before. And now, after all this time, some of them were beginning to wonder if it was time to go back. A young woman named Kira stood on a balcony overlooking a city that sang with the voices of 10 million souls. And she looked up at the stars that her ancestors had placed in the sky. Somewhere beyond those stars, beyond the walls of the garden, the galaxy that had once threatened to destroy her people still existed. What had it become in their absence? What had happened to the species that had tried to kill them? And most importantly, was there anything humanity could do to help? Kira did not know the answers, but she intended to find out. Kira Okonkwo stood before the Council of Voices in the great chamber at the heart of the garden, and she spoke words that would change 2 universes forever. We have lived in paradise for 5,000 years, she said, her voice carrying to the millions who watched through shared consciousness links across the planet. We have become wise and powerful and peaceful, and we have built wonders that our ancestors could never have imagined. She paused and looked around the chamber at the faces of the council members, some human in the old sense, some transformed into shapes of light and crystal, some existing as patterns of thought projected into physical space. But we have also become isolated. Kira continued, we have forgotten that there is a universe beyond our walls, a universe filled with species who are suffering under the same tyranny that once threatened to destroy us. The council listened in silence as Kira laid out her proposal. She wanted to reopen the threshold, to create a doorway back to the galaxy that humanity had fled so long ago, not to conquer or to take revenge, but to offer help to those who might need it. The debate that followed lasted for decades. Some argued that humanity had earned its peace and should not risk it by returning to a galaxy that had tried to kill them. Others pointed out that the Conclave might have grown even more powerful in humanity's absence and could pose a genuine threat if provoked. Still others questioned whether humanity had the right to interfere in the affairs of species that had developed their own cultures and societies over 5 millennia. But Kira and her supporters argued that humanity's transformation carried with it a responsibility. They had been given a gift of time and safety and the opportunity to become something better. If they hoarded that gift and refused to share it, were they really any different from the conclave that had once judged them? In the end, the vote was close, but the decision was made: humanity would return to the galaxy, not as the desperate refugees who had fled, but as something new, a species that had learned to transcend its worst impulses and wanted to help others do the same. The reopening of the vegetable threshold was a project that dwarfed even the Original construction 5,000 years before engineers who existed as pure. Mathematics designed modifications that would allow stable passage between the garden and normal. Space beings of energy volunteered to serve as anchors. Their consciousness stretched across the dimensional barrier to hold the doorway open in physical humans, those who had chosen to retain bodies that could interact with the material universe, prepared to be the first ambassadors to a galaxy that had forgotten them. On the day the threshold reopened, Kira stood at the center of the activation chamber with a small group of volunteers. They had studied everything they could find about the galaxy they were returning to, but most of their information was 5,000 years out of date. They had no idea what they would find on the other side. Whatever happens, Kira said to her companions, remember why we are doing this, and remember who we have become. And do not let fear turn us back into what we used to be. The threshold activated with a sound like reality itself taking a breath. Light poured through the opening, harsh and yellow compared to the gentle radiance of the garden's artificial sun, and then Kira stepped through and became the first human to enter normal space in 5 millennia. She emerged into chaos. The coordinates where Earth had once existed were now the center of a vast debris field, the remnants of a battle that must have taken place relatively recently. Ship fragments tumbled through the void, and distress signals blared from damaged vessels of a dozen different designs. Kira's enhanced senses took in the scene instantly, and she felt her heart break for the suffering she witnessed. Whatever had happened to the galaxy in humanity's absence, it had not been peaceful. Within hours, Kira and her team had made contact with the survivors of the battle, a mixed group of refugees from species that had never existed when humanity left. They learned that the Conclave had fallen apart centuries ago, fractured by internal conflicts and external rebellions. In its place, a dozen smaller empires had risen and fallen, each one claiming to be the rightful successor to galactic authority. Wars had become constant, and billions had died, and the dream of a unified, peaceful galaxy had become a bitter joke. But the refugees also carried stories, legends passed down through generations, about a species called humanity that had once defied the Conclave and escaped to a realm beyond the stars. Some of these stories portrayed humans as demons, and others portrayed them as gods, and most portrayed them as myths that had never really existed at all. When Kira revealed who she was and where she had come from, the refugees did not believe her at first. It was only when she demonstrated abilities that should have been impossible, healing mortal wounds with a touch, creating food and water from nothing, communicating across distances without any visible technology, that they began to understand. The humans had returned, and they had brought miracles with them. Word spread across the galaxy. Faster than light could travel, species that had been at war for centuries declared truces so that their leaders could travel to the coordinates where humanity had reappeared. Some came with weapons, afraid that the humans had returned to conquer. Others came with offerings, hoping to gain favor with beings they considered divine. Most came simply out of curiosity, desperate to understand what had become of the species that had inspired legends for 5,000 years. Kira addressed them all from the deck of a ship grown from living crystal. Her voice broadcast across every frequency and into every mind willing to receive it. Long ago, your ancestors told my ancestors that we were dangerous, she said. They said we were too aggressive and too unpredictable and too creative in our methods of destruction. And they were right. She paused, letting the words sink in. We were all of those things, and we were ashamed of none of them. But we also knew that we could be more, and so we left. And we spent 5,000 years learning how to be better. Images appeared in the space around her, images of the garden, of the wonders humanity had built. of the peaceful civilization they had created. We did not return to conquer you or to judge you. Kira continued. We returned because we have something to offer: knowledge and technology, and perhaps most importantly, hope. Because if we could transform ourselves from what we were into what we have become, then so can you. The representatives of 100 species listened in stunned silence. This was not what they had expected from the legendary humans. Not conquest, not vengeance, not superiority, but an offer of help freely given. We will not force our ways upon anyone. Kira said, we will not demand submission or worship or even gratitude. But if you want to learn what we have learned and build what we have built, we will teach you everything we know. She smiled. And in that smile was the weight of 5,000 years of transformation, and the memory of every human who had ever lived, and the hope of a future brighter than any the galaxy had ever known. The galaxy threatened Earth, Kira said, and humanity responded by turning its back. But we turned our backs so that we could learn to face you again as friends instead of enemies. She spread her arms wide, embracing the stars and the ships and the countless beings who watched her with wonder and fear and hope. We have come home, she declared, and we have brought gifts, and if you will accept them, we can build a future together that none of us could build alone. In the years that followed, the galaxy changed more than it had in the previous 100,000 years. Wars ended because the reasons for war disappeared. Diseases were cured because humanity shared the medical knowledge they had. Developed technologies that had been considered impossible became commonplace. And species that had been enemies for millennia learned to live as neighbors. Not everyone accepted humanity's gifts, and not every problem was solved. And the galaxy remained a complicated and sometimes dangerous place. But it was better than it had been, and it continued to get better. And the legend of the humans who had turned their backs on a galaxy and returned as something greater became not just a story, but a lived reality. And at the center of it all, Kira Okonkwo stood as a bridge between what humanity had been and what the galaxy could become, carrying forward the legacy of her ancestor, who had first seen a door where no one else could. The galaxy had threatened Earth. Humanity had responded by turning its back, growing beyond measure, and returning to light the way forward for everyone. It was not the ending anyone had expected, but it was exactly the ending that humanity had earned, and it was only the beginning.